So today we're going to talk about consciousness, vijnana, and it's the last in the series of talking about the five aggregates or khandas. And when we talk about consciousness as one of the khandas, it's pretty straightforward. You know, it's really just what helps us cognize whatever we experience through the senses. It's absolutely essential for our ability to know anything about the world, but it is just, making, being aware when we see, hear, taste, touch, smell, or think something. And, as we talked about earlier, there's this, kind of, we sense something, and what we perceive, we feel, and we cognize with our vijnana what we perceive. And there's this idea of contact, as you know, when our senses are active, like we see something, we have the eye, which is operating as it should, and then there's an object that we see. And then in order to actually have a real experience of that object, to know it's there, we also have to have the eye consciousness. This is the way the Buddha talked about it. That's what helps us. That's what makes that contact possible. He said, if your eyes don't work, you don't see anything. If you don't have something to see, you're not going to see anything. But if you don't have the consciousness there present to be aware, to know, to make sense of this, to identify it, you also don't have that contact. You won't see anything. And so he talked about eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, which feels tactile objects, and mind consciousness. So the awareness of a thought, being able to take that in and be aware of it. So this is how we know the world. This is how we know about anything external. You might even say internal, anything through our six senses, if you're willing to think of the mind as a sense organ. And of course, that's what the Buddha, he talked about internal sense objects and external sense objects. And those are all those pairs that go with our senses. And that includes the mind. So the same things that we see the Buddha talk about the other khandas is true for consciousness as well. It's impermanent. If we cling to it, it's suffering, and it's definitely in the sutta, in the middle length discourses called Right View, number 9. There's the part in consciousness reads like this. You have said the noble disciple understands consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, leading to the cessation of consciousness. And in that way, they understand right view. And they've arrived at the true Dhamma. And then when he talks about what is consciousness, he said the 6 classes of consciousness, as I just mentioned: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. And with the arising of formations is the translation I'm reading from. It's sankhara, and arising of something that's there because it's also cobbled together kind of, or conditioned form, conditioned whatever it is, sound, smell, taste, whatever, the arising of those sankhara, then there is the arising of consciousness. So this idea that when you're not seeing anything, when your eyes are closed, or maybe when someone is blind, eye consciousness doesn't arise. It only arises if the eye is seeing something and that thing is there, then it arises. And when the cessation of that sankhara goes away, or you stop looking at it or noticing it or hearing it, the sound stops, then that consciousness ceases. And he says the way to leading to the cessation of consciousness is the Noble Eightfold Path. So how do we understand that? Obviously, it means more than that momentary consciousness coming and going. That it's also about clinging and wrong views, seeing wrongly. So we'll get into more of that. When a noble disciple thus understands consciousness, the origin, the cessation, and the way leading to it, then and there they make an end to suffering. And that's another way that a noble disciple has right view. So in that sutta, Venerable Sariputta goes through these many different ways that we can have right view or not. And one of them is like really getting what sense consciousness is. But it is sense consciousness. I also have a little quote here from the simile of the snake. So that's Majjhima Nikaya 22, where the Buddha, again, he's talking about all the different five khandhas, but where consciousness is concerned, just like with the others, he says any kind of consciousness, whatever, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all consciousness should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And seeing this, a well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with material form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with formations or sankhara. If you look at Bhante Sujato's translation, that it would be choices, the volitional activity that creates these sankhara, and disenchanted with consciousness. So disenchanted with this sense consciousness, because he's talking about the khandhas here. Being disenchanted, then the noble disciple becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, the mind is liberated. And when it's liberated, there's the knowledge that it's liberated. And then one understands that birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, and there's no more coming into any state of being. Now, that's pretty straightforward with regard to sense consciousness, but there are other ways that the Buddha used the word vijnana. And back in May, when I was visiting Portland, I was at the Portland Friends of the Dhamma, and a couple of you were also. And Ajahn Sumedho was there, and he gave a talk, which I found really inspiring. And it's interesting because I guess the first time I heard a talk by Ajahn Sumedho was in 1998. So 24 years ago or so. And he's been saying, and I lived in his monastery for a couple of years, and he lived there then and gave talks frequently. And of course, I've heard a lot of what he has to say, and many of you have. But he had a clarity that day that I found really powerful. So I'm going to play a 10-minute segment of that talk. Right. I'm just going to start this as he's about to open the Q&A, and it's this question that someone asks right at the beginning of the Q&A period that he's asked about sense consciousness, about the khanda, and then he goes on and makes some things very clear. So here we go.
So I've been advised that I should stop talking and open the remainder of time for questions. I'm hard of hearing, so Ayya Santussika must come and tell me what you're saying.
So could you discuss consciousness as one of the five aggregates?
The five aggregates are all impermanent. So consciousness through the senses comes and goes and changes. But Dhamma, I'm just opening up to questioning. There's Dhamma, which is apparent here and now and doesn't change. And there's consciousness. When you let go of phenomena, of conditions, there's still consciousness. We call it empty consciousness. And it's silent, it's peaceful. It doesn't change according to conditions. This you can realize for yourself. And in my life as a monk, monastic as a monk, I've had a whole, decades of time to explore this. And so in Thailand, there's monks talk about jitwang, or empty consciousness. And so I really explored that in my life as over the past 50 years. What is emptiness or consciousness without attachment? So the consciousness in the five khandas is dependent upon the body. You've got the rupa, vedana, sanya, sankhara, vijnana, that's about the physical conditions that are very impermanent and unsatisfactory. So consciousness that we experience through the senses is unsatisfying, because like just losing your sight or your hearing is unsatisfactory. So I'm still conscious through the senses. I can kind of get a hazy view of you over there, but it's not like I wish I could see more clearly and hear you without Ajahn Ashoka having to interpret. So there's references to consciousness, invisible, infinite, being everywhere. Vinyanang adidasanang anantang sapado pabang. It's part of the scriptures. And this particular phrasing, I've never heard, and before in Thailand, I've never heard any monk talk about it. And where I heard it was in the Buddhist society in London by a by a Parsi philosopher, a Persian philosopher, who was very much acquainted with the scriptures, and he was teaching at Buddhist Society summer school every year about Vinyanang Hanidas Nanganantang Sabado Prabha. And so I found it in, I think it's in the Udana and several others. But that began to take an interest. Invisible, infinite, splendor everywhere, and that's consciousness. So Vinyanang is consciousness, but it's not eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, and so on. The consciousness operates, like sending it's always operating through the senses. This is what we're conditioned to do, to see, to hear, to smell, taste, touch, and think. This is all through the senses, through the brain, through the organs of the body that are very impermanent and unstable, can easily fall apart. But what I've found is what is permanent, what doesn't change no matter what, is awareness, conscious awareness. And I relate that to Vinyanang Anidasanang Anantang Sapado Pabang, the consciousness invisible, infinite, everywhere. And in the elements, so much emphasis is placed on the solid element, the water element, the air element, the fire element, earth, fire, water, and air, and the impermanence of these elements. And then space and consciousness. So there's consciousness, then there's space, then there's the four elements. And you realize that space couldn't exist if there was no consciousness, or the elements couldn't manifest if there was no space. So it's consciousness that we can, that when we talk about conscious awareness, mindfulness, awakened conscious awareness, this is what we can, each one of us as human individuals can realize for ourselves. And this is the end of suffering, because in the third noble truth is the end of suffering. So with mindfulness, what they call connected mindfulness, not just mindfulness of objects through the senses, through awareness, you suddenly lose your fascination for the forms in space, the thoughts, the views, the conditioning, the ego. You lose that, you're no longer very important. And what is the reality that we can realize is awareness, here and now, conscious, infinite, invisible, everywhere. And then when you realize the utter beauty of that, trying to find peace through institutions, through cultural differences, through class identities, racial identities, endless like that, trying to bring peace and love and kindness is very idealistic. But how can it be possible when each one of us has to live through the conditioning, the karma of our egos, our cultural conditioning, our whole way of thinking? But what transcends all that is conscious awareness, which is impersonal. So as a person can't get enlightened. When we talk about the Buddha getting enlightened as a person, but that's just the best you can do with language. Because the ego never becomes enlightened. It can't, because it's a creation. So in monastic life, monks trying to become enlightened, become stream enterers or arahants, it's still part of the ego, wanting to get something you don't have. I'm unenlightened, I want to become enlightened. If I sit in meditation, I'll get enlightened, or we look at various monks, teachers as enlightened or unenlightened. But in terms of personality, I can't see how a personality is not an enlightened personality, because it is just a creation, an illusion of a separate self. But your true nature, when I tell people their true nature is perfect, they don't believe me. Because we're usually identified with what's wrong with us, what we think is weakness or fear or cowardice or guilt, or we endlessly analyze ourselves. Why do I have so much worries? How do I conquer anger and jealousy and fear? How do I get rid of these kind of unwanted emotional states? And, as a personality is developed through all those states. It's part of the personality to fear, to be guilt-ridden, to be jealous, to be greedy, to want things that you don't have, to want to get rid of what you don't like. It's all very much conditioning. But what transcends personality, the ego, the cultural conditioning, the language, is conscious awareness. There could be no ego if there is no consciousness. So the consciousness, the ego, is something in consciousness. It arises and ceases. And we begin to recognize the end of suffering here and now. And then that's what we call stream entry. Or so when you have that first insight into the absence of the ego. And so that's why silence, the space between thoughts. I've emphasized the importance of thinking rather than trying to figure out Dhamma with more words or study scriptures, is to investigate, to observe thinking itself. Because, you can observe when you think one word, then there's nothing. So I take some kind of neutral statement that didn't arouse any strong emotions in me, like I am a human being. So that's a kind of matter-of-fact belief, doesn't arouse any strong feelings. Pretty boring thing to think. And then just the word, the English pronoun I, just one letter, and there's nothing. And you begin to notice that, to notice emptiness or nothing. And then you intentionally think am. Before you think am, there's nothing there, there's just conscious awareness. And then am is two letters, and then there's silence. And it's beginning to, this is what we call connected awareness, is when you're not just connecting one word with another, one concept or opinion or view with another one, or making judgments about them, but observing the way it is. So over the years, just developing that awareness of the space between words, and as I deliberately think. And when I was a Samanera, before I met Luang Por Chah, I had an insight that I had to stop thinking. And I tried to stop thinking because I had this insight. And, I couldn't really stop thinking, just as a desire to stop thinking. And I thought, I can't meditate, I just think, and and I've got to stop thinking, and I try to, willfully stop myself from thinking, but I couldn't sustain it. You can't sustain just willful resistance to thoughts, because it's still the ego operating. I've got to stop thinking. Where I started thinking, intentionally thinking, but not taking an interest in the words or the thoughts, but the space around them. And the silence that the word arises in. What is that? It's fully conscious. It isn't programmed by culture. It's not personal. And it's as simple as that. It's just by, intent. And then the fun of that kind of method was I started investigating all the thoughts I was afraid of. Just intentionally, deliberately thinking, but notice not taking an interest in the meaning or the words, but in the space, the silence that they come and go into. And after a while, that silence became very strong, because it's here and now, and it's not created. It's certainly not personal. So out of this, you begin to feel this oneness, this connection to everything, all the created conditions, the animal kingdom, the nature itself, the planet, the sun and moon and stars, because suddenly you realize consciousness has no boundary or limit, and this is just a form in consciousness. And consciousness doesn't die. It's infinite. It's invisible. Sensory consciousness, very unstable. So in the five khandhas, that's what they're talking about. Sensory consciousness is impermanent.
Speak of as we start to witness no self and transitory aspects, and that as a doorway to connection of a reality that is anchoring. How does love and compassion relate within that?
Well, in emptiness, then like they have these four Brahma Viharas, Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha. Are they just ideals according, you read them in the scriptures and they're beautiful ideas to have loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity. They're all beautiful English translations of these four viharas. They're called dwelling places, viharas, and but they're natural. They're not just trying to be nice and spread loving kindness to everybody as a person anymore. It's not like me being really nice and kind and in a good mood and spreading loving kindness to all creation, like it can be as a kind of, when we think about it, take it personally. But it's conscious itself, empty consciousness is unconditioned love. It includes everything. It's non-judgmental. And compassion, then, the sadness at the misery of others become apparent. You see around you so much suffering, and it isn't that you're totally indifferent to it, but you understand it. There's compassion. There's not just me feeling sorry for poor people or something like that. And then sympathetic joy. Joy at life itself, at the beauty of nature. Like we spent the past 10 days in Seattle, and look at this rhododendron time. It's kind of beautiful, and went to Ajahn Sudanto's hermitage, beautiful to see. There's a joy in that beauty. It's a simple thing. It's not trying to be joyful about beauty anymore, but it's just the way it is. It's spontaneity. And equanimity is peace. So you find your refuge in conscious awareness, in Dhamma. That's your refuge. Then that's very peaceful. But it's not like indifferent, like you're a zombie or you're totally cut off from everything, or you don't care anymore, but it's then the Brahma Viharas manifests quite spontaneously just through awakened awareness. So like loving kindness, metta is, when the formula for spreading loving kindness, you spread loving kindness to the devils and the angels. You're not just spreading loving kindness to angels or more to angels, and you don't spread as much loving kindness to devils. That's the discrimination. Devils are bad, angels are good. But it's no discrimination in awareness. There's no hatred there. That's love, that's unconditioned love.
So I hope you get to listen to that again and maybe again and again, because there's a lot in there. And the link is in the chat, but also if you go to the Portland Friends of the Dhamma website, then you can find it under the teachings. And right now it comes up right at the top of the page. And if that changes over time, you can still look at Longpa Sumedho's talks, and I'm sure it will be there. And maybe even download it on your computer and listen to it again and again. Sometimes people say that Longpa Sumedho always says the same thing. It is kind of true, but I know for myself, even those very first 2 talks of his that I was given on cassette tapes. So, what were we doing in 1998 or 7 or whatever time it was? And I had to listen to it over and over and over because it was a complete paradigm shift from what I had understood about the world before that. And what he's saying these days, it seems to me, as Ajahn Ganha would say, that this sounds like it's coming, or he didn't say it sounds like, but this is coming from an awakened mind. And, that clarity and confidence that we can all experience this. This is really precious to take in. So when it comes to consciousness, don't get caught up in the sense consciousness bit. That's the real exclamation point. Neil?
So you answered one of my questions, which was, is he an arahant? And even when some of what he says seems a bit abstract, and I have to really sort of dig into my mind to see if I'm getting it, there's just that sense there that he really knows what he's talking about from experience.
Yeah, I can't say that from my own experience, but I can say that our friend Ayya Viveka, who lives at Ajahn Ganha's monastery, told us that there were 2 public announcements right before Longpa Sumedho was going to come back to England, because Longpa Sumedho was living in a monastery just down the road from where Ajahn Ganha's monastery is, and he came to visit Ajahn Ganha a couple of times for sure during that period. And then Ajahn Ganha had this announcement at 2 different public events that Luangpa Sumedho will be returning to England as an arahant. And it was Ajahn Ganha declaring this. And Ajahn Ganha has been known by many to have had this realization himself long ago in his 20s. And I know that it's, Ajahn Chah was very opposed to people talking about attainments and who's got what attainments. And so the monks trained in that tradition are rarely going to say anything like this. And when I told Ajahn Pasano about this, what I heard from Ayya Viveka, he said, is Luangpa Sumedho saying this? And I said, no, he's not. But Ajahn Ganha is. And Ajahn Ganha, I think he wants us to take this seriously. He wants us to understand, and he apparently feels strongly enough about this to actually make that declaration public. So even if you let go of all of that, whatever who thinks what of anything and anyone, it's like you said, Neil, just listen to the words and bring it into your experience and work with it, and then you find out. So we don't have to get stuck on who's got what attainment, but to really know that this is for practice. This is not for intellectual inquiry or figuring out who to give the most donations to. This is about practice. Buddha said, if you want to revere me, if you want to pay respects to me, if you want to support me, then go practice and find out for yourself. So it's incredibly wonderful that we have the opportunity to hear this kind of teaching. And of course, it's going to bring up questions because we're still looking at the world from the senses and from attachment to the senses and to thinking this is who we are. But that's going to change when we let go entirely. Another place to look at more on this is in the book, The Island, which was written by Ajahn Pasano and Ajahn Amaro. And the phrase that Luangpa Sumedho used in Pali, Vinyanang anidasanang anatang sabato pabang, is discussed in The Island. It starts on page 133, actually, looking at my notes. And you will find this in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 49. You'll find it in the Digha Nikaya, in Sutta 11. And I think we'll take number 49 this week, Wednesday, and talk about it, because I think it will give us a chance to really look. It's a very enigmatic kind of statement in the suttas about the consciousness being infinite and luminous. But we'll take a look.
What was the page in The Island?
133.
Thanks. And my other question real quickly was, I just wanted to clarify that since the beginning part was a bit muffled, I got the sense that the general tenor of his response was to make a distinction between sense consciousness and this other more permanent consciousness.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sense consciousness being unstable, unsatisfactory, not self. And then the Buddha used consciousness, the word vijnana, to give us a sense of what it is to be aware. What is this? Sometimes he'll call it pure awareness or pure consciousness. There's a talk that you can find online of Ajahn Sumedho called "What the Heck is Pure Consciousness?" It was a question posed to him. But I felt like this 20 minutes, 10, 15, 20 minutes, this was really clear. And I really appreciated the follow-on question about the Brahma Viharas, because this is how it connects. You know, that when we've let go of consciousness as a personal thing, when we've let go of all phenomena as personal, then what's left? It's kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, equanimity. And when he talks about how it's a spontaneous, natural thing to have this joy and love for nature and for all beings, it's a really beautiful. This is where you're headed. This is your path to awakening that you're walking right now, every one of us. And this is what we will experience. And hearing how it feels and how an arahant responds to things, and how that's helpful, because that helps us go in the right direction and gives us inspiration to keep going. Karen?
Thanks. Yeah, I saw that, listened to that speech as well when he was here. And I found it really amazing and inspirational too. You could just tell that I don't know if he's an arahant, I didn't really think about that. But what I thought was like, wow, he's a really muted sense of the I. You could just hear it in his talking. You could just really feel it in him. So I found it was inspirational. But the question I kind of had was, of the 5 aggregates, I find the consciousness the most confusing.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, with his talk, he seemed to be pointing to that awareness that you can see sometimes in your meditation, where you're, if you're sitting back from your thoughts and you can see, thoughts and body and things going on where there's no I. And I always find the sense of I attaches now to that awareness. Is that what he's talking about? That awareness that's kind of sitting back from phenomenon and watching? That was my question.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I think that starts to give us a chance to, I think we would, think of that as mindfulness, which he also talks about. He also mentions, mindfulness. This is, that observing that, we're looking at things from that more neutral perspective of presence and awareness. So I think so.
Yeah. Should we, when meditating, maybe turn our attention to that awareness and start?
Yeah.
I get a little fascinated with the thoughts, they're watching how they create themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Watching all that and not turning the attention back to the awareness.
Yeah. This is what we want to do. This is the practice, the preparation to recognize the realization is that none of this is self. That it's all just conditioned phenomena occurring. And then when Luang Por Sumedho talks about how we feel one, how we feel connected to, or it's not the same as we're all one. That kind of statement has a tendency to come from the ego. But when it transcends the ego, then we do have this connection to everything else, because it is not self. It's just conditioned phenomena. You recognize the relationship with everything else and everyone else who's suffering, who's happy, who's, it's like that. And it happens because we take that step back and stand on what feels to me like more solid ground as we observe.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa?
Okay, I think I sort of understand at times the difference between the the consciousness, the Khanda consciousness, which is also impermanent and subject to clinging and causes suffering. And what Ajahn Sumedho was referring to as empty consciousness, which is, I mean, these words have such double meanings, multiple meanings, that they get confusing, but empty consciousness is more what we're aiming for, and it has so many different terms, also pure awareness or ordinary mind, or I guess it's kind of like Buddha nature. But what really, a different question I have is, or a question that comes up a lot for me, is when he was talking about how to notice emptiness between words of thinking. And I've heard that many times before, that you can think a thought like, I am a human being, and then watch what happens in your mind after that. The trouble for me is that so much of my thought process, my mental process, is not words. It's, as I've meditated more, I've become aware of how much of it is emotional states or mood, more like moods, which are not distinct like words. They're more like clouds or even mud sometimes. And some of the moods, I think, are chronic moods, which I feel are completely enveloped by. It's really hard to become aware of those as just processes that come and go with something bigger or something in between. So I was just wondering if you had any comment about that. That would be really helpful for me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up. I think that, like this this thing that Luang Por has talked about, observing the words and the space between the words. And sometimes he used to talk about noticing the space between people, like you're sitting in this big room with all of these people sitting for meditation or whatever, and or listening to a Dhamma talk. And he said, do you see the space between the people? And all of these things are techniques. This is a technique to try to get the mind to see things differently, to recognize this is not just our ability to perceive and make sense of the world and avoid being eaten and find what we can eat and figure out what you can mate with and what you can't and all of that jazz, which is what all of these living beings have been conditioned to do, but instead to start to really step back and see from a different perspective. And so what you're talking about, I mean, I take that kind of like looking at words or whatever. This is just a pointer to sorting out method. So like, what are you going to do? And the Buddha was all about method, said Ajahn Panyawado. I thought that was an interesting statement. He gives so many different approaches to practice and to trying to see reality, because we do have different experiences. And so just by noticing, oh yes, so much of my experience is feeling, so much of it is mood, so much, like, what do I do to step back from that and see that as a mood? Like sometimes it's helpful to put words to it. And sometimes it doesn't matter so much. Sometimes it's helpful to have a witness to it. Like if I tell Ayya Chitananda that this is the mood of my mind, sometimes that helps me place it in the right context. You don't have to have another person listening, but it's like, finding a way, like you said, finding a way to not let that mood of the mind fill the entire screen of your awareness. How can you step back and see the space around that? I remember Ajahn Amaro talking about this years ago. He said, when we start to turn our attention to a feeling or a problem, I mean, a lot of the time we are plagued by some kind of suffering that's deep within that we just keep trying to keep out of sight, and we're pushing it away and we're pushing it down, and we don't want to don't want to let it come up because it feels like it's going to fill the whole screen and there will be swallowed up. But instead, recognizing that no matter what we think is filling the whole screen, if we have mindfulness, we can step back and see it as an object. See it as something, as a phenomenon that exists in the moment that we can observe with space around it. And that's especially true with feelings or experiences from the past that we have shoved into the dark. Because when we bring them into the light, they tend to shrink down from being huge monsters to being little squeaky. And that's just how it works. So I really feel like we have to be creative in a sense with our own mind and work with what's there in a way that, works for us. So try things. Try things.
Yeah, thank you. I hear you saying it might help to name a feeling or mood to sort of get a handle on it, and maybe to notice when it's not there, or to have someone else name it. Thanks.
And I've noticed that sometimes talking about something helps to, like you have a recurring dream, and then I've noticed if I talk about it with someone, it stops recurring. It's like, or the other thing can happen. You talk about something and it builds it up and makes it bigger. And a lot of times it depends on how we talk about it. And so it's important to notice these things. It's back to the doctor metaphor of the Buddha being the physician and having the medicine. And, we have to look at how the medicine works. Is it working? Is it bringing more peace and happiness and freedom and lightness? Or is it causing more trouble? Is it bringing more distress? And it's just like that. Right? Doctors and nurses in the room, we've got a few, right? You have to look at the result. What's this medication doing? And this is what we need to do in the practice. And concoct a few of our things of our own in the back room. See how it works. Thank you, Lisa. Yes, Paula and Phil.
The later you are in the raising your hand, the more things you think of. But I wanted to say that I just loved what Lisa asked, first off, because that's the most recent thing. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is doing some of the practices that we've been talking about over the last month or two about feeding your demons and feeling and like recognizing the first, second, and third, noble truths. So I'm guessing that's what you're saying that you have to experiment with. Is that what? Am I correct there?
Those are some methods. I mean, certainly the noble truths. The Buddha laid that out because that's the basic framework of how to approach this experience we're in of impermanence and suffering or unsatisfactoriness and not self. That we take it as permanent. We get really wrapped up in it. We suffer a lot, and then we think it's me or mine. And this is how we unpack it. And with the first three noble truths and using the fourth one as our lifestyle, as the way we live, as the way we practice everything, so that we can see through this. And what we're talking about today is this seeing through it, seeing it for real, and then being free from the distress.
What I was, before Lisa talked, what I was going to mention was that it seems like and I have a follow-up question. It seems like what Ajahn Sumedho was talking about was very, very closely related to what we did with our sutta study last Wednesday night.
Mhm.
And in fact, it was so fascinating because Phil mentioned it too, right after I'd thought of it. And in that the realized mendicant is able to view the world without this attachment.
Mhm.
And that's what Ajahn Sumedho was saying, is that you can, if you're in that space of consciousness, but you're not attaching to all of those sense things that are coming at you, that's where you find more peace, and that you become realized in that space. I see you're shaking your head, so you're great. Well, then I don't know if you want to say anything else about that. Go ahead.
No, that's correct. That's correct. It was that sutta that we looked at on Wednesday night was right on. It was showing from all those different perspectives that the Buddha gave what the Arahant experiences, how they see it, how they naturally experience it and express it. And that sutta, was that 112? Do we know the sutta number on that one? I think maybe, anyway, we can look back.
So the only question I had left was about, he mentioned something in his talk about space and the elements, and I couldn't quite understand that.
Yes, so talking about earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And what he said is that you can't have earth, water, fire, and air without space. And you can't have space without consciousness. But it all arises and ceases in consciousness. So this is every bit of what Lungpa says and has said for over the years, almost every talk. I can't remember any talk he's given where he hasn't ended with, "This is for your reflection." So it's like, I'm giving you a pointer, now go practice, and see that for yourself.
That makes it sound like space is another element. Earth, water,
It is.
fire.
In the suttas, it's described those when, sometimes the Buddha talked about the 4 elements, sometimes 5 elements, and sometimes 6 elements. And when it's 6 elements, it's those 6. It includes
Okay, I didn't know
space and
that.
consciousness.
Right, that explains it. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Paula. Neil.
Just something that you just said, and I don't want to feel like I'm getting too nitpicky, but you said it all arises and ceases in consciousness. And I guess I have to ask, which consciousness? Sense consciousness or that pure consciousness?
Certainly not sense consciousness.
Oh, okay. And
that wimpy, unsatisfactory, unstable consciousness. No, not that one.
Oh, okay. And another thought that just came to me, in a talk that he gave at a Bayagiri, I guess it was last month, I noticed that he uses Buddho a lot and refers to it as the knowing. And I wonder if that's kind of synonymous with this pure consciousness that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what I've been hearing, of course, Buddho is knowing, or the awakened mind. It's Buddha. It's a different grammatical form of Buddha, and Buddho is used in Thailand as a meditation object. I use it too when I do walking meditation. Buddho repeating in my mind, and yes, there is this way of talking about the one who knows. And in Poisson-Meadow, you'll hear him talk about mindfulness in the same way. These things that are present and have no beginning and no end. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Neil. Karen?
Just a quickie question. This pure consciousness we're talking about, it doesn't arise and pass away. It's permanent.
I believe so. Or, yeah. I mean, this is what Lung Pa is saying. I mean, it's kind of interesting when you look up those references in the suttas, like Majjhima Nikaya 49, whatever number that was, where that phrase in Pali is found. Then there's a long footnote by Bhikkhu Bodhi about how Venerable Nyanamoli first translated it and how he's translating it and what the commentary says about it. And the commentary equates consciousness there with Nibbana, and Bhikkhu Bodhi's like, that doesn't make any sense to me. So you can see this is something that people are, thrashing over. But we only thrash over it from the position of not realizing it. So we're listening, perhaps, to people who have realized it. And then, the words, it's not like it's something you can't know. So it's not just saying, oh, you can't really know God. God is the ineffable. You can't really know Nibbana. It's ineffable. It's not really quite like that with the Buddha and the Dhamma, because we can know and we need to know ourselves. And when the Buddha describes it as the highest happiness, as the end of all identification, as the complete end of suffering, I mean, there are some definite descriptors that are pretty straightforward, but still, we can't really grasp it until we grasp it. So, like we have these uses of the word vijnana, and we're trying to figure out what it means based on the words. But the arahants are talking to us from experience, and they're trying to put words to an experience. And this is how, like in Thailand, you'll have different attained individuals using different words to describe what's going on, because the words are an approximation. So I think you're on to it. I think that's right. And I think we, will know for sure as we realize, I mean, really, what is the key? What is the point? What is the realization that is really the thing? And it's the non-identification. It's the not being personal. Like Ajahn Sumedho saying, he's working with words in that way to realize it's not personal. It's not. What if we didn't take anything personally? It'd be so much easier, wouldn't it? Yeah. Then you get to that point where none of it's personal at all.
I get some glimpse into that once in a while, and you can get the idea of how peaceful that would be.
Yeah.
Sustain it. You just get these real glimpses. And in that moment of detachment, you can really feel, the I, just causes so much burden. Like it's just so demanding. And I'm always griping about maintenance, like the maintenance of the body. It drives me crazy.
Yeah. It's a demanding sucker, it really is like always something.
And myself, like, we were talking about comfort on Wednesday, that demand for comfort, right? I feel myself doing all this work for comfort. I would love to let that go.
Joyce? Thank you, Karen. Go ahead, Joyce.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this. I'm always really afraid to share. I actually had written out a whole little dialogue about this because it related so much to consciousness in the aggregates. But now that I've heard the talk, there's been a shift in the way I'm holding it. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do this, but I've really always wanted to have, I don't know, someone's insight into something that I experienced and still do. I really had a hard time sitting in the hall with a lot of people. I would have just an enormous amount of stress and anxiety. And so I really focused on walking. And I just did that. I was devoted. I mean, I was always out there walking, even when once the temperature went to 107, I was out there walking. It's like mad dogs and Englishmen. I mean, really. And one day on the walking path, and it was just the same old, just walking back and forth and really trying to feel sensations. And I turned around and suddenly, I don't know, something just opened up in this huge way. And I was just in my body. I could feel everything, the temperature, shadows, just everything, every movement. It was just so strong. And it continued for most of the retreat. I mean, when I was walking down to the hall or brushing my teeth or anything, there were obviously gaps, but it was, it just really went on for most of the retreat. And I haven't been able to do that again on the walking path, but I'm finding, there was one day I was out walking, this was on another retreat, I think. I was just walking and I was approaching some scenery and suddenly the scenery was coming toward me. And it was just very profound, but it was, again, very freeing and uplifting. And I've always been questioned the joy because that seems to be personalizing it. But I felt just immense joy in all these things that I'm describing. And then yesterday, because I was preparing for this this class, because I've been really interested in the aggregates and really could not wrap my mind around them. And I'm starting to understand it a little bit better. But the author was talking about the sense of being walked. And that led, of course, I mean, I've also been feeling this too, like this sense of no self when this is happening. And I can do, I mean, I just go walking in the neighborhood sometime, I can feel this. So I don't really know what this is and what to do with it. I don't want to see it as a special experience, but it seems more profound than that. And I don't know like how to work it into the rest of my practice. And I was especially thinking about like perceptions, because it seems like whatever is going on could also be applied to more awareness around perceptions and not just about sensations. I don't going, anything you have to say would be of use to me.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce.
And hiding this and I,
Yeah,
just a special experience, you know.
yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, there are many things that happen, of course, as we practice things like this. And I think they're really useful if we do as you're doing with it, to not identify with it, not to like, you know, try to make it your goal to re-experience, because that tends to stop us really. But to recognize that there are more things to know and see than we ordinarily see with our ordinary perception. And that it's joyful and uplifting. But I think exactly as you said, you recognize that this happened. This is something you know happens, this shift in our awareness, in our way of seeing, our way of experiencing phenomena. And that all of this, what we're observing is one way or another khandhas. And we're experiencing, of course, through our senses, of course, still, but that there's these ways, and meditation, following the Noble Eightfold Path, can bring these things on, but they're also not essential to awakening. And it's important to not think this is awakening, because sometimes people do. They have a sort of, special kind of, or, unusual experience like this. And then sometimes people think they've hit upon awakening, but the ego's still there. So it's like to see it as encouragement, and to see it as a signpost that we're going in the right direction. And then, to recognize there are these moments of, special, if you will, experiences, and to really appreciate them, but not get attached. And to recognize that, okay, we're on the right track, let's keep going. Not to try to regain them, but to just keep going. See what else gets revealed in the practice. Just letting our mind be at rest, relax. If the memory of such an experience is inspiring and supportive, great, bring it to mind. If there's something that, sometimes experiences in meditation can come with a message of sorts. And then you can reflect upon that and see if there's more that we can that unfolds as a result of contemplating what happened. So that's what I would say. You don't have to hide these things, because, man, especially monks and nuns, we hear all kinds of stuff. There's so many variations and things that can happen in meditation, and it's not anything to be feel like, well, I gotta hide this. And as I say that, we also need to have some wisdom around who we share it with, because sometimes people can really react in a way that's discouraging to us about what we experience. And so having some discernment around that. Obviously, this group of people are really hot on the track of real practice, deepening practice. So I think it's fine to share in this context. And I think I hope that I'm communicating a kind of balance around it, really appreciating it, but don't cling to it. Don't hold on to it tightly. And know that there's much, much more in front of you to experience, and just let it happen. It happens through just doing the practice, relaxing, letting go, noticing where we're clinging or holding on, or what we want to have be different than it is, and just keep letting go and working with it.
Yeah, I think I got the idea. There was kind of discouraging response by somebody about, not to put too much into special experiences. But we contemplated it, and I don't think it was just that. It was something to me that was a sign of freedom.
Yeah.
Always held that for all these years, and we're talking years, it might even be more than a decade, maybe even 2 decades. I've been holding this and not being clear on what happened. But, this conversation about the aggregates and my doing some study around it as we've been going through these 5 weeks, started to realize that it was actually a very significant part of my practice, because I had so much difficulty with sitting meditation. I really felt like a failure. Was this thing? No, that's a special experience. You should ignore it. And so I've always been kind of wrestling with it. Now during COVID, because I'm out walking a lot, I experienced it over and over again. And it's a release of a burden, because I'm so serious and, questioning myself a lot.
Yeah, this is good, Joyce. So recognizing like how this kind of freedom can be felt, like this is a real thing. This is something, yeah, to allow.
That's what I've been getting from this whole session, but I just decided I just wanted to show up today because I'm usually hiding over here.
Yeah.
So
I'm
thank you.
glad you shared. Thank you. I mean, it's really common to hear negative responses when we share about our meditation experiences, especially when there's some kind of breakthrough. And there can be different reasons why a person would respond in those ways, but generally I think it comes from a lack of understanding of the array of things that can happen that are actually encouraging and on the right track. And I mean, if especially if you happen to talk to someone who wishes they could have experiences that they're not having, they might feel kind of negative and respond kind of negatively when they hear someone else having it. So you want to just really talk to people you have experience with who are trustworthy and being able to take in something that maybe they've never experienced themselves, but that they can appreciate. And also, really looking at do I see this anywhere in the suttas? Because sometimes we experience things before we ever even have a connection with the Dhamma or know about the Dhamma. And then you read the Dhamma and it goes, oh, right there, it's there, right there. That's what happened, and then you can put it in that context. So when we're telling the Buddha about it in a sense, and the Buddha is responding, then we're probably going to get the right amount of encouragement and guidance for going in the right direction.
I think in one case, when a teacher kind of put a little bit of a damper on it, I think it was really a protective move on the teacher's part. Get too lost in the exceptional thing.
Right.
But because I don't share very often, I didn't get a chance to follow up on that with that teacher. This has been really helpful, and I really, really appreciate you talking with me about it. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. That is true. I mean, sometimes you see people have a special kind of meditation experience, and then if someone tells them, "Oh yeah, that's you become a stream enterer," your experiences check all the boxes, and that really screws them up. It's so damaging sometimes when that happens. So it's not easy to either hear the response that's going to help or give the response that's going to help, and it's not to criticize in any case, but we have to take the responsibility to check how well the medicine is working and make changes as we need to, and not take it too seriously if it feels like some advice, whether it comes from me or anyone else, doesn't fit what you're experiencing, because maybe we just don't get it quite. Just watch out for the ego trying to claim anything. That's really the point.
Yes, right.
It's really about that, because that's where we get messed up. Yeah, thank you, Joyce. Neil, you're welcome to leave if you have to leave, but I'm fine with hearing your question or comment, Neil. Oh, you're muted again. I don't know why you're getting muted.
Because I'm trying to use the space bar for a change of pace, but I don't know, it doesn't quite work.
It's finicky.
What?
It's too finicky.
Yeah. I just wanted to share this because I could hear the sort of anxiety in Joyce's sharing, and so I thought it might be helpful for me to share. and I haven't talked about this in a long time, but I had two very similar experiences during meditation retreats, and you know, everything that Ayya's just been talking about has been valuable for me to hear again as well. The first person, when I shared it with the teacher at the time, I said, "Is this like? Am I getting like a temporary glimpse of Nibbana?" And she said, "Well, no, because Nibbana isn't impermanent like that." Yeah, I mean, the main thing I've learned that, I mean, I know I don't sit around waiting for it to happen again. I just let go of that years ago. And I just sort of appreciate it, like you said, as sort of like a signpost saying, you know, there's something more, and you can get to it. You've gotten to it a little bit, and you know, and that's just the way I look at it.
Yeah. Great.
I don't know if that's helpful. But
Mhm. Yeah, thank you, Neil.